Hey, what's up, everyone? It's Nick Juskewycz of DailyFantasyWinners bringing you another episode of Tee to Green. And for this episode, it is the PGA Championship, which is the last of the four majors of the year. I usually do two videos for each major, but I got a little off schedule this week, so we're just going to run through everything in this episode of Tee to Green. So let's get right into it. This year, the PGA is at Baltusrol Golf Club. It is being played specifically at the lower course. Here, it is a par 70 that tips out at 7,428 yards. Since this is a par 70, that is certainly a little bit on the longer side. It is a par 34 on the front and a par 36 on the back. It's actually usually a par 72 golf course for the members here, but basically two of the holes on the front nine have been converted from shorter par 5s to play as longer par 4s for the pros, which certainly makes sense. The last two holes also on the golf course, meaning holes 17 and 18, are par 5s, which is certainly a little bit of a unique feature. Number 17 is 649 yards. Number 18 is 554 yards. So number 18 actually is the only hole that is going to reveal any eagles that basically don't require hole outs from off the green. Just to give a couple of stats from 2005, number 17 only had one eagle, and when that certainly came in a hole out, from several yards out, and it only allowed 87 birdies as well over the 4 days. And then you take a look at number 18, that featured 20 eagles and 223 birdies in 2005. And Adam Scott actually in one of his interviews this week had referred to 18 more as a long par 4 actually in the way it's going to play as opposed to a par 5. And you think about 20 eagles in 2005, that's a pretty high number for one golf hole at a major championship that was 11 years ago. With the advancement in technology and the hole playing relatively the same distance, I think we're going to see a lot of eagles there on that hole, especially since we've got some, it seems like the temperatures have been pretty hot there. It's been pretty across the entire country, but nevertheless, they get some rain there recently, and it's very humid there, so the greens are going to be fairly soft, so I think that even helps the case even more for some more eagles. But from the distance standpoint, it shouldn't matter too much as far as getting the eagle advantage. Some more details here. It was the Baltusrol was, again, like I said, it was last year in 2005. There have been several renovations to the course since '05. So basically, course history in terms of player results is not going to help you here at all. Not to mention, it was just simply over a decade ago. But in terms of looking back at results from a statistics standpoint, there's a slight positive correlation to longer hitters, but it's not dramatic. I've heard some things that people think it is fairly dramatic just because it's over 7,400 yards and it is a par 70. But at the same time, again, like I said, there's only one eagle hole on hole 18, and so it's just not quite as necessary in my opinion. It is good to have some longer hitters in your lineup, but it's just not necessarily you have to prioritize it. And even when I say longer hitters, it doesn't have to be guys that bomb it over 300 yards. It doesn't have to be your typical Jason Day, Dustin Johnson, or Rory McIlroy. It can be guys that hit it, 290 or a little over 290, whatever. That's perfectly fine. Actually, Phil Mickelson made a good point in his media session earlier in the day on Tuesday. He said that a lot of the golf holes you could run shots up onto the green, and the holes where there are forced carries are coming on a couple of the par 3s, and then the shorter par 4s we're going to have more wedges. So for the most part, some of these medium length hitters, it's not going to be that big of a deal for them. Being a really short hitter, that's going to be certainly at a disadvantage. But I think medium distance hitters it's not going to be that big of a deal. Okay, so some other course details here. The winning score back in '05 was -4, with only 9 players under par. So this played actually somewhat like a U.S. Open back in '05, which is kind of a bit ironic since Phil actually won that golf tournament. And the U.S. Open, while he's played very well at the U.S. Open, it's still the one major he is searching for. The fairways are a bit narrowish, and they move the fairway bunkers closer to the fairways, as well as moving some of the bunkers back, just because players are hitting it longer now, and it essentially was a necessary renovation as time has moved on. There are 3 cuts of rough. Generally speaking, the farther away you get from the fairway, the worse it gets. The rough is also relatively thick around the greens. It's what it's supposed to be, and that's supposed to be one of the course defenses primarily here for this week. I don't think it's going to be as bad as a U.S. Open, but I think you're going to see it close, the rough length around the greens closer to that at a standard U.S. Open, as opposed to what you might see at your average PGA tournament or your average golf course. course. The winning score, I think, will be better than 4 under just because we're seeing that the conditions are not like soaking wet, but just because it's humid and they've got a little rain earlier this week, there's supposed to be a little more rain that comes in later in the week. I would say that the winning score is going to probably be more in the 10 under range. So it will be a little bit better. And just because scores have generally improved over the last handful of years thanks to technology and the game of golf growing and players are getting better a little bit. And so let's see, moving on here. Lastly, as far as how this golf course is going to play, the front 9 is a little bit more open, but since it is a par 34 and a few of the toughest holes on the entire golf course are on the front, it'll be the tougher 9 in relation to par. The back 9's actually a little bit tighter, and it does have a few more holes where water does come into play off the tee, but it's just actually more scoreable, and that's because it's because it's a par 36. So you got the 2 par 5s, and that's going to help it out as well. And just a couple of the holes in terms of the scoring average just aren't quite as difficult, even though it's bringing some water in, it's a little bit tighter. So it's actually somewhat similar in Augusta National a little bit in regard to the water coming into play on the back 9, but it being a little bit more scoreable. Essentially, it's just the back 9's going to have a higher variance because it's going to play a little bit easier, but with the penalty strokes involved and it being a little bit tighter, you're going to see some wide variety of scores on the back 9 in my estimation. And especially coming down to the last couple holes, I think you're going to see it as well. So with all this known of what I just said, some statistics to look at. Strokes gained off the tee, strokes gained approaching the green. And actually, ever since the statistic came out, I've been finding more and more that this should be weighted the most when it comes to researching different golf courses, just generally speaking. The reasoning for this is actually relatively simple. It's the stat that basically connects the dots. And what I mean by that is if you are really good in this area, it raises the floor and the ceiling of your game the most, and ultimately your scoring average. If you're really good in one of the other strokes gained categories, it doesn't necessarily raise the floor and the ceiling of your score, or it essentially doesn't do it nearly as much. It's really, it's really connecting the first part and the third part of your games. And if you're really strong in approaching the green, you're usually just generally scoring better in comparison to being ranked at a certain point in some of the other strokes gained statistics. So that is just something to keep in mind for the future, but it will certainly come into play here. Strokes gained around the green is good. There's going to be some scrambling, no doubt about it. With a longer golf course like this and some longer rough and several bunkers around the green, scrambling is going to be an important element. Recent form, as always, is a good thing to look at, but I would not also, this is important, I would not value the Open Championship results too much as far as the recent form goes, just in terms of how you think somebody's going to play. I would more only use it just in terms of potential ownership bump or decline, if you will, in terms of how they did the Open Championship. Just remember, there was a big difference in the scoring of which tee time wave you were in at the Open Championship, so not all scores should be treated equally. And it's also just a completely different style of golf over there, especially at Troon with the links golf and the weather that was dealt to them. So I wouldn't look at that too much as far as how well you think someone's going to play this week. So where are we next? Driving accuracy is not that important this week. Now, as I say that, you don't want to be spraying the ball everywhere, and you don't want guys that are in really bad hitting the ball form, essentially. That's not a good thing. But simply saying, finding the first and even sometimes the second cut of the rough will not be, I don't think, that big of a deal at this golf course. There just aren't a ton of penalty strokes off the tee on this course, except for a couple of the holes on the back 9. Another detail about the PGA Championship, there are no amateurs in this event. And that's actually a little bit of an important note. And I bring this up because the amateur spots in this tournament are essentially replaced by club pros. This is the only major where only professional golfers are in the field. Brian Gaffney, who's in the tournament this year, actually made the cut last year and finished tied for 71st when it was at Whistling Straits. He was the first club pro to make the cut at the PGA Championship since 2011. It's not always that rare, but it gives you a good idea that the amateurs usually have higher upside when it comes to the PGA Championship of where they're going to finish on the leaderboard. So essentially what I mean by this is you probably don't want to roster the club pros. And if you want to spend some time researching them, go for it. But I really do think at the end of the day, you're more likely wasting your time and you're just trying to get a bit of a minor miracle for somebody that's going to really finish near the top 10, 20 of the leaderboard, or just luck out on a couple eagles or hole outs or something like that. So in any case, lastly, before we get into the picks, Please definitely take a look at the odds per dollar sheet on on DailyFantasyWinners.com. The reason for this is these salaries remind me of some of the pricing we saw back in like DraftKings, PGA Daily Fantasy in like 2013 and maybe even the early part of 2014. There's some really bizarre prices out there, particularly in the $7,000 to $6,000 range, especially $6,000, and they will very likely have high ownership, which means fading them is most likely a good idea if you're making several lineups. I will tell you which guys fit this category at the end of the video, and if you're following me on Twitter right now, I've made a few notes about this already, so you'll know what I'm talking about, and we'll get in in just a second. But we're going to move on to the picks. So as far as the forum goes, I'm going to give you all the different tiers like I did for the Open Championship. I liked going with that format a lot more as opposed to recommended ownerships, because everybody's doing a different amount of lineups for their GPPs and some people get confused. So I think it's just best to go by tiers by the specific price ranges. So check that on Daily Fantasy Winners Forum for advice on everybody. But we're going to give you tier 1 here in this video. But actually first, even starting at the $11,000 range, I'll talk about the four $11,000 level golfers. When I did the Open Championship video, people thought I was skipping over Rory, and it was just a bad mistake. I actually just didn't bring Rory up at the Open Championship only because I didn't need to elaborate on it much since he wasn't in the top tier. So just to clear this up, I'll spend a tiny bit of time on the top 4 golfers in Jason Day, Dustin Johnson, Rory McIlroy, and Jordan Spieth. So I think there is a reasonable, there's good reasoning, or at least reasonable reasoning, to use all 4 of these guys a certain amount of the time. I will start off by talking about Jason Day at 11,700. I still think he is the best play of these 4. Reminder, he was only 17 to 18% owned in the Millionaire Maker at the Open Championship, and since he's still the most expensive golfer, and he hasn't done exactly anything since the Open Championship to spike his that would warrant spiking his ownership. He played okay or decently he played decently, I should say, at the RBC, but he wasn't great. I don't expect that ownership to come up at all. So I think that's very good ownership for Jason. When I think this, and I think if you took a poll on this and asking who is the best player in golf right now, I still think Jason Day would win that poll, at least from golf fans, or reasonable golf fans, I guess, in my opinion. But I know Dustin's playing a little bit better as of late in terms of the results are concerned, but still Jason's not playing poorly by any means of the imagination. And I think it's in a funny way, you're getting good value on Jason and comparing his price to some of the other guys. So I like Jason the most. For Dustin at 11,600, he was owned about 30% at the Open Championship, and I have seen no reason why that number would change very much for the PGA. I was thinking it might go down a touch because some people may have seen that at the Open, and they might have been turned off by it to remember that for this week. But at the same time, Dustin's still playing amazingly, and a lot of people are kind of leaning toward the longer hitters in this tournament. So I kind of, there's kind of reasons to look at on both sides here. I just don't see his ownership changing much. Maybe it goes down to like 27, 28%, but I'd be shocked if it's any lower than that. And so obviously Dustin can do well here. I just wouldn't want to commit one of these top golfers for this tournament at that high of ownership, essentially. I just think that's a very steep price to pay. If you really are that convinced of Dustin, then just make sure when you roster Dustin a bunch or a little bit or whatever you want to do, use some variation in your lineups and use some guys that will be on the lower owned who's not owned nearly as much in terms of your $8,000, $7,000, $6,000 level golfers, whoever you use. I would just make sure you're not using a bunch of high salary or highly owned guys of the lower salary players. There we go. So so that would be my recommendation. But I do think Dustin's still not. I think you can make the argument he's tied with Rory as 2A and 2B right now. I think that's a perfectly fair argument, but I would still take Jason as a slight step above him, and that high ownership is not exactly the most appealing thing going into the week. So moving on to Rory at 11,400, he's obviously got very good results. In a way I would describe Rory this year is he's right there. It just seems one day he's always off, or one thing of his game is always off, and it hasn't quite clicked. But his talent obviously is as good as anybody's, and he's right there. The Open Championship, you'd probably point more to the bad tee time wave more than anything, but still, he wasn't going to, most likely he was not going to catch Stenson and Phil even in the good tee time wave. But nevertheless, as far as Rory goes, I think his ownership will be no more than 20%. I would say probably in that 18 to 20% range is a fairly good guess, and I think he's a fairly solid play. He's not my tier one. I mean, Jason, I'm just going to say Jason's the tier one play for this. I'm just making a clear distinction, but I think Rory's a perfectly fine play. He fits this course well, if anything, with his length. His high ball flight is good. He'll throw darts like he'll just be able to attack every pin with with the humidity and the softness of the greens, and how high he can hit the ball. So he'll just throw darts at the pins, which is a good thing. And it wouldn't surprise me if he won the golf tournament. So anyways, that's enough on Rory. You get the idea there. And as far as Jordan Spieth, 11,100. I think his ownership at the Open was only about 15% in that range. I think it's going to be less here because I think a lot more of the options right below Spieth are a little bit more appealing this week than they appear to be at the Open Championship. So I actually believe that Jordan will maybe even just be like 10 to 12% owned, and that is perfect time to buy Spieth if you want to play the ownership game here. It's somewhat similar to what I said at the Open, although Spieth was in the bad tee time wave at the Open, so it didn't quite work out that well there, but. I think Jordan. People also sometimes forget about Jordan. Even though he's not a bomber, he still hits it a pretty good length, and his length's actually up this year in comparison to last year. And I'm pretty sure he pointed that out in his media session at Baltusrol today on Tuesday. So he hits it well over 290. I think in his last 6 tournaments I saw in FantasyLabs, he's hitting it over 300 yards. So he has length to crank it out there. And so I would say that Jordan Spieth is a great person to buy right now for this tournament. I think he's got a very good shot at winning this tournament, and I think he's kind of the lost, forgotten one here a little bit. So let's move on here. I will bring up Henrik Stenson and Phil Mickelson briefly here. These are not tier 1 plays. I would basically say right now, I'm going to bring up Henrik Stenson, Phil Mickelson, and Sergio Garcia for this matter. Sergio down to 9,400 as well. All 3 of these guys are all high ownership guys, and I would just be a little bit hesitant here. When it comes to Stenson, players after winning their first major usually have some sort of setback in their next tournament. It doesn't always happen that way, but it happens fairly frequently. And Stenson's going to get a pretty good bump in ownership this week for kind of obvious reasons on how well he played at the British. It was historical, so keep that in mind. As for Phil, his upside's obviously very good, and he's been playing, I think, better than most people expected this year. But still, Phil's floor in terms of it's kind of scary for somebody at 10,200. Like, if you told me right now Phil missed the cut the PGA, would I be surprised? A little bit, but would I be shocked? No, I probably wouldn't. So I would just say Phil's ownership's going to, I think, be pretty good, and his floor's a little scary to me there. I'm not saying you should fade Phil, but I would just be cautious of your ownership of him. Sergio, I think, is going to have crazy ownership, almost at Dustin's level. He should have about 25% ownership. He's got a bajillion top 5s as of late, and he's got as probably the best odds per dollar in this range he does have the best odds per dollar by far in this price range. So his ownership is going to be out of control. Honestly, just ask yourself, does Sergio have a reasonable chance at finishing just tied for 20th, tied for 30th even in this tournament? I think it's a very reasonable thing to consider. I know he's had a lot of very good results lately, but at the same time, I would definitely strongly consider that I don't think Sergio is warranted of 25% ownership despite being only in the mid 9,000s. I mean, it wasn't that long ago when Sergio was priced in the $8,000 level, upper $8,000 level range at a major, and we were just kind of like, I don't know about that. And his recent results still weren't that bad. So I don't really recommend putting a lot of stock into Sergio this week as far as your ownership goes. Now let's get back into the tier 1 play. So we're adding on to Jason Day here. My favorite play in the 9K range for tier 1 is Bubba Watson at 9,000. Very good price, shouldn't be too highly owned, but I really like his length, and more importantly on top of that, this course has a lot of slight dog legs, and which is absolutely perfect for what he can do with his shot shaping and what he can do with that driver. Also, the trees on this golf course aren't really right on top of the fairway, and if you hit it into the rough, you're still gonna have plenty of room to work with in terms of what you want to do with wedge or iron shots coming out of there. And Bubba's got all the strength in the world to hit it out of, maybe even if the rough's a little bit thicker. So I just think he's got plenty of creativity with his approaches and what he wants to do with the golf ball, and especially with some softer greens, that could really help in terms of what Bubba wants to do. And he's not going to be as limited where he has to land the golf ball. I think it's a great time to use Bubba. Bubba should be reasonably owned, decently owned, but it should not be that high. I don't think it'll be that crazy. There are plenty of good options in this price range, but Bubba is by far my best one. I'm not even considering ownership. Bubba's my favorite. So I'm definitely in on him this week. Obviously, he can rack up a lot of birdies and eagles to boot as well, even there are not many eagle opportunities on this course, but he's as good of a candidate as any for hole 18 eagles. In any case, so my favorite play in the $8,000 range for tier 1, Brandon Grace. He should really be in the mid $9,000 range as far as I'm concerned. He will be owned some, certainly, probably like Bubba, but given his last two performance, on top of just being priced around others who will be very highly owned as well, I just don't think it's going to be as high as some people may think. I would guess probably in the 10 to 12% range. Maybe at the absolute worst, it gets up to closer to 15, but I'd just be shocked if it's anything above that. This is a fairly high number still for somebody at $8,000, but just considering that Grace has proven that he can win on any type of golf course at this point in his career, and just there's no hole in his game. He's great all around and very good ball striker. He is at least a clear step in front of everybody in this price range, in my opinion. So Grace is easily my favorite play in the 8K range for tier 1. I've got a much bigger tier 1 list for the $7,000 range. There was just specifically Bubba and Grace were really standing out to me in those ranges. So they're the only ones on tier 1, and there'll be a much bigger tier 2 and tier 3 list. But tier 1 for the 7K range, there wasn't just one name or two names that really stood out for the $7,000 range to me. So I've got a handful of them. So I'm going to go ahead and just read them off here. 7,900 Lee Westwood, 7,800 Martin Keimer, 7,800 Shane Lowry, 7,600 Jim Furyk, 7,300 Rafa Cabrera Bello, and 7,200 Justin Thomas. So obviously there are a lot of names here. But generally speaking, all these should be owned some or maybe even a decent amount. But I don't think it'll be too out of whack when you consider, again, there are a lot of mispriced players in this range who will be owned at least 15% and probably more, even closer to 20, that will be on the recommended upcoming fade list that I'm going to give here a little bit at the end of the video. But as far as these guys that I just rattled off, they fit things along the lines of they're in good recent form, they're a longer hitter and a good fit for this golf course, or I just simply think they have great value. Things along those lines. But again, I don't think their ownership is going to be too high that you need to be too worried about it, and they're just simply my favorite plays in this range. And then the 6K range, again, I will admit there's some extremely bizarre prices in this range, and predicting ownership as we get cheaper and cheaper in this tournament, I actually want to dive into this for a quick second, it's really unique for this golf tournament. And the reason why I say is because since we have particularly a lot of options in this price range, but at the same time, you only need so many cheap golfers in your lineup, generally speaking. Like, you can put all the great cheap golfers you want in the $6,000 range. Well, I guess up to a certain point, but they all just cannot be very highly owned. So it is a little bit tricky and unique this week, just because even in tournaments past where you have a few of these $6,000 level golfers standing out, there's usually only like 2, 3, maybe 4 that particularly stand out. This week, it seems like there's a lot more when you take a look at the odds per dollar sheet, listen to other places around, seeing who people are picking or talking about as high ownership possibilities. So it is pretty tricky this weekend. I think that's going to probably be the number one thing I will just be looking out for personally this week, and I would be doing it if I were any of you guys. Just pay attention to who's highly owned and who's owned what in the 6K range. I think it's a good thing to note for the future in case this situation comes up again. But with that, here is I'm giving you three 6K guys for my tier 1 list, who are Emiliano Grillo, Tony Finau, and Nicholas Colsaerts. I don't think their ownership is going to be extremely high in the fade category. I do think Gorillo and Finau could be decently owned. I will say probably at least 4% and as much as 7, maybe even 8, which is I think perfect. Which I think is okay for the $6,000 range. Maybe even 9% would be okay. If it gets to double digits, that's when it starts to get a little bit iffy. Kind of around this drop off here, especially for a major. The Colsart should be more in like that 3 to 5% owned range, maybe even less than that. So there should be no concerns there. Grillo and Finau are a little bit toward the border for me on this, but I really like both of them this week, and I think you'll be okay there from the ownership perspective. Now for the fade list. Again, this is tricky, but these are the names that I thought would stand out the most of the bunches of golfers essentially that were potential candidates for this. So starting at 7,800, Brooks Koepka. I don't think the injury is actually going to pull as much ownership away as people think. That recent history of his, regardless of the WD, on top of the fact that he's really like a very much of a daily fantasy favorite because of all the birdies and he generally acquires and the DraftKings points he usually accumulates. I think his ownership will still be very high. I think it'll be at least 15%. I do. I've never seen. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong on the comment section and on this video, but I don't remember Koepka. Koepka's always priced around this point in majors, and I don't remember his ownership ever being under 15%. So. You can tell me if I'm wrong on that, but that's what and I don't think the injury is going to change much of anything still. It might pull away like 1 to 2% or something like that. So I would say fade Koepka. And the other thing I'm actually going to throw in on Koepka here as well, and this is important, and this is actually a reason for not using him as well, and I just don't think many people are going to actually maybe realize this. Brooks Koepka just fell out of the top 8 in the Ryder Cup points, I believe, or he's right there on the fringe, and he's running out of time to get to qualify for a Ryder Cup spot in the top 8. And there's captain's picks, for the last 4 spots, but you need to be in the top 8 to qualify. And Brooks has never been to the Ryder Cup, and he definitely, obviously, really wants to go. Everybody does. So he is potentially. I don't know. I haven't talked to Brooks or anything like that, but I'm saying there is plausible reason to believe that he might be pushing it this week because it is a major championship. If this was just your average PGA Tour tournament, maybe he wouldn't. So there is possible reason to believe it. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it would just be a supporting reason to fade him when I still think the ownership is going to be relatively high. Okay, another guy, J.B. Holmes at 7,700. Playing extremely well in the top tournaments, really good recent form. I think his ownership's going to be too high. Unfortunately, even still at 7,700, I think it'll be pretty high. Brandt Snedeker at 7,500. I cannot believe this. His odds per dollar are insane. I thought for sure after the last 2 weeks, especially last week at the RBC, his price would bump up more than this into the lower 8,000 range, at least where he should be, because Snedeker and Kuchar are basically. There's not much difference between them, and the fact that Kuchar just has better recent form, obviously. But generally speaking, on average, these guys are about the same. And Snedeker stayed at 7,500. The odds per dollar loves him, and historically, that has been a huge indicator on when high ownership comes. So I was so ready and hoping that Snedeker would just kind of have that T15, T20 at the RBC, and if he of course was there right down to the end, and it just spiked, and Vegas loves him. So it's just the way it worked out there. So I would just say, because Snedeker obviously could certainly miss the cut, I would say you can go ahead and I would recommend fading Snedeker there at 7,500 because of the high ownership. My most confident fade here next is Charles Schwartzel at 7,300. He has by far the highest or the most crazy odds for somebody in this entire tournament. He's essentially got the odds of players that are in the upper 8,000 range. So that pretty much tells you right then and there that Charles Schwartzel will be owned extremely highly. And then for the $6,000 level golfers, Gary Woodland and Kevin Chappell, two guys in very good form, I think will be very highly owned. Daniel Berger at 6,600, he's basically in the same category as Koepka to me. I think he will still draw fairly heavily with ownership. And then Jonathan Vegas at 6,500. It's kind of funny. I've heard a lot of people talk about how they still don't think Vegas will be owned that much. By far the most important thing when it comes to high ownership, and we see this pretty consistently, and I'm a little surprised it's not talked about more, is recent performance will always play the most important role when it comes to high ownership over anything else, regardless however a course is set up or what type of golfer it should fit. If there's very good odds per dollar, if the person's playing extremely good golf and has plastered wins or top fives in the last couple of weeks, that's going to stand out more than anything above all else. So I love Vegas. I mean, it worked out well last week. He was on my A list last week and he won, which was fantastic. But unfortunately, I've just got to say, I think his ownership is going to be over 10%, or maybe about 10%, I should say, this week. So that's a little high for me for somebody that, quite frankly, could very easily miss the cut. And the last thing I'm going to say about fading, this is kind of a sidebar. Matt Kuchar at 8,500. He will also be very highly owned again. He was 26%, I believe it was, about at the Open Championship. That should dip slightly for the PGA, but it will still certainly be above 20% in my opinion. It's a risky fade considering I still believe Kuchar could win a major, and his recent performance is very good. However, it is worth noting he usually doesn't do well on longer courses, and his performances at majors the last couple of years they've been okay, they've been decent, but they really haven't been great. So, and he's not exactly the birdie machine that you necessarily want. I'm not saying this course is going to promoting the extremely aggressive birdie to eagle guys, because there aren't that many eagle opportunities. But at the same time, it's right. It's basically, I'll say that. Wrap it up with this. It's a bold move if you're making a ton of lineups to fade him, but it could be an awesome move as well. It's just extremely bold because it could certainly backfire, but at the same time, his ownership is going to be very high in that mid $8,000 range. That if you did elect to fade him and he did happen to miss the cut, which is it's got an outside shot at it. It could be really awesome. So it's just a high risk move if you want to do it that way, and I'll just leave it at that and leave it up to you. And we can talk about that more on the forum here, and hopefully I explained that clearly enough. So in any case, that's it for the PGA Championship preview. Hopefully you got all that information crammed in there. And my next video will come up soon, very soon. Hopefully before the PGA Championship starts. My next video will examine why it's important to fade the higher-owned, cheaper players as opposed to the more expensive ones, and I'll dive into kind of just what's a good rule of thumb in certain situations, maybe based on how many lineups you're making and what the tournament is, and it's just not a straightforward thing, and that's why I think you see a lot of different opinions out there. So I'll dive into that a little bit the next video, and if it is not out by the time the PGA Championship starts and you want to ask me about this, then please bring it up in the forum, and I'll be happy to discuss it with you there. It's been a very hectic week, so I apologize about that and putting this video out a little bit on the later end this week when it's a major championship. So, as always, please, if you like this stuff, like and subscribe to our Twitch and YouTube channels, and then you can follow me at Juskewycz on Twitter and DailyFantasyWinners on Twitter at DFSnerd. Okay, thanks everyone. Good luck.